Okay, so today we are talking about Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And Rousseau is the second social contract theorist that we're going to study. The first was Thomas Hobbes. And so these two figures, Thomas Hobbes and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, take place in the section of the course dealing with human nature. So we're asking, well, what does it mean to be human? What are the different visions of humanity that have been offered by various thinkers? And certainly Hobbes is very, very famous for his pessimistic view, the sense that we're violent, we're fundamentally selfish, that if humanity was left to itself without a major power ruling it, then there'd be major problems. There'd be chaos, life would be really hell on earth. With Jean-Jacques Rousseau, we get in many ways a fundamentally different perspective. Jean-Jacques Rousseau is going to disagree with Hobbes at a fundamental level on a number of issues. Okay, so first, I'm going to kind of get into him. Who is he? Well, he was born in Geneva, Switzerland in 1712, and his father abandoned him. And so his father was someone who was fairly well-to-do. They were, a decent family. They were respected. They had a decent amount of wealth. And when his father abandoned him, Rousseau lost all of that. He was left poor. He was left an orphan, and he became a servant, an apprentice. And his first master was very, very cruel, very, very mean, very demanding. And this really impacted Rousseau dramatically and profoundly. And it shaped his thinking in many ways. And it shaped his thinking in the sense that he had a strong hesitancy and he had a strong rejection of bondage. He did not believe people should be enslaved. He did not believe people should be servants of another. And eventually, he became famous because of his writing, and he was sought after, and he was a big shot and became a big wig. But he never felt comfortable in the upper classes. He never felt comfortable in that level of society. And this, along with the people that he offended, eventually led to his insanity. That's how he ended his life. But okay, so what does he think about human nature? Well, in this reading, we're going to look at two of his works, a Discourse on Inequality and A Social Contract are those two works. And in A Discourse on Inequality, he's trying to ask, well, what is humanity's basic nature? And he thinks that this is not an easy task. For Hobbes, it was fairly easy. You look at human beings, and you recognize that they are selfish, egotistic, violent, competitive, confrontational. For Hobbes, the difficulty is that we have to distinguish what humanity is in its nature versus what it has become as a result of society. So he thinks that our nature has been shaped, has been influenced, has been impacted greatly by society. And he doesn't think it's in a good way. He thinks our natural state, again, unlike Hobbes, is actually the better state. Rousseau thinks that we are better off in a state of nature before society. Okay. Whereas Hobbes thinks that the state of nature is terrible, Rousseau takes the opposite position. And when he looks at human nature, he says there's two basic guiding principles that drive human beings. One is an interest in our own preservation, our own well-being. You might say kind of an egotistic or, kind of an individualistic principle, but there's also, and again, this is unlike Hobbes, there is also a compassion for others. We naturally are concerned about others. We naturally aren't simply interested in our own well-being, but we are also interested in the well-being of others. And so this means that really we are going to care about others, and we're going to want to do things for others, and we're going to be troubled when others are in peril, or others are in anguish, or others are in agony. And so he asks, okay, well, if this is our basic nature, if we naturally care about ourselves as well as others, how do we end up in a society where there's these great inequalities of wealth? Rousseau would fit in very nicely with contemporary politics. He'd certainly be a voice in contemporary politics because he is inequality, which is, again, very important in our contemporary political world, is very important to Rousseau. It is what he views as one of the greatest evils, if not the greatest evil, that has been produced by humanity. He says, well, how does that happen if we're supposed to naturally care about others? And this is what the Discourse on Inequality attempts to answer. And he says, all right, well, first we got to realize there's two different forms of inequality. There is what he calls a natural inequality. A natural inequality is this idea that some people are stronger, smarter, better looking, fitter, what have you, more harder working. There's just natural differences. Some people are more agile. Some people are more brawny. Some people are wonderful at writing poetry. Some people are whizzes at math. Some people are experts in philosophy. And so we have these different attributes. We have these different traits, and that is natural. That form of inequality is not something that Rousseau is worried about. What he's worried about is what you might call social inequality. And that is where essentially it's an inequality based upon the structures and the institutions and the attitudes and the history of human beings. And that's where you end up with some people, some individuals, or just some kinds of people, whether it be race or religion or, a particular family, that are more honored, they're more prestigious, they've greater wealth, they have greater power than others. And this is what really bothers him. And so to find its source, well, how does this arise? How do we get to a position where some people have a lot of wealth, a lot of money, a lot of power, a lot of fame, and others do not? And so he begins this exploration by talking about the state of nature. And in the state of nature, our existence is really centered around survival. And we spend most of our time getting food, sometimes procreating, building shelters, resting, recuperating, that kind of thing. Our existence is based upon fulfilling our basic needs, taking care of those basic needs. And, for a lot of people, they would say, well, that sounds awful. It's terrible. But for Rousseau, this is actually a beautiful thing. And he's very envious of the freedom that the people in this state had. They could go hunt for food if they wanted to. They could stay in if they wanted to. They could build a shelter if they wanted to. They were not enslaved to anyone. They were not dominated by anyone. That's really critical. That is what their freedom consisted in. And the only thing, because there was no society, there was no structure that we were trying to climb up the ladder for, we really only wanted things that helped us survive. They helped us live well, good shelter, food, that kind of stuff. And because we were in nature and we were, struggling for survival or working on survival, we tended to be very strong, very healthy, again, according to Rousseau. And because of this, he believed that we were actually happier then than the state of nature. For Hobbes, the state of nature is hell on earth, awful. Nothing could be worse. For Rousseau, nothing could be better. It was bliss. It was happiness. It was satisfaction. It was fulfillment. It was freedom. Okay, so you get this state of nature and great inequalities don't exist. There's nobody that has a lot versus somebody that has a little. And because there was no inequality and there was no possessions, there was no kind of jealousy, there was no competition. And there was no sense of competing against others. Just think about that today. How much of our lives is spent trying to procure things? Possessions, titles, jobs, positions, recognition, to make us better than another, to make us stand out more than another. A lot of our lives and a lot of our well-being is oriented towards that. And that didn't exist in early humanity for Rousseau. And if, somebody took your possessions in that early time, well, you just move on. If somebody took your cave, you just go get another cave. If somebody stole your food, you just go hunt for some more food. So Rousseau envisions this early humanity as a time of great plenty, as a time of abundance. There was no sense in which there were few resources being controlled by the powerful, and the masses couldn't have access to it. No, essentially everybody had more than enough for themselves, and if somebody took something, you just move on. No big deal. And so then how do we get to this terrible position we're in now? How do we get to this social inequality? Well, For Rousseau, it all begins with this idea of possession and private property. He says the first person that put a stake in the ground and said, this piece of land is mine, not yours, that's when inequality started. That's when humanity began to go downhill. Because they'll essentially say, look, I may be stronger than you, or I may be smarter than you, or I may be faster than you. But in a state of nature, there's so much of resources that it doesn't really matter. I can get on. You may get a bigger bear or something, but I'll be able to get enough for me. Once we have private possessions, then those that are stronger, smarter, more skilled, faster, whatever, they can begin to accumulate more possessions. They'll begin to gain more possessions. And those that don't have possessions will have less and less. And this doesn't simply occur at an individual level, but whole families, whole societies could begin to procure more and more and more at the expense of others. And eventually we end up in a situation where, some people have all the stuff, and those that don't have it have no access to it. They can't get wealth. They can't get possessions. They can't get better lodging. They're stuck in their position. And again, Rousseau is very much relevant to contemporary political society. Okay, and then we also, with these possessions, we begin to really think that we need certain possessions, that we have to have that smartphone, that a microwave is an absolute necessity, you cannot live without a car, you cannot have any sense of happiness without a TV. This, for Rousseau, when we make these possessions necessary, and he's very much like Karl Marx on this, it begins to, again, increase that competition, increase that jealousy, increase that lack of satisfaction. And think about it. How often are you comparing yourself to others? There's been certain studies that say, look, those that use social media more tend to be less happy. And the reason for that is they're always comparing their lives against others. And on social media, everything is always happy, great. Not always, by any means, but a lot of times people are going to put up things that flatter themselves or that make themselves look good, and we can begin to be jealous by that. Why am I not as happy as that person? Why am I not doing as much as that person? Why don't I have as much stuff as that person? And again, this all goes back to Rousseau to private property. Okay, so you have this. We end up in this terrible state. And how do we get out of it? Well, that's where the social contract come in. And that is kind of the blueprint for Rousseau for how do we address inequality? How do we overcome it? And for Rousseau, the ultimate goal is a radical vision of freedom and equality. Some people say those two things can't go together. You can't have radical freedom and radical equality. You can't have great equality and great freedom. Rousseau thinks you can. Okay, so how do we get there? How do we get to a society that isn't marked, isn't dominated, isn't defined by, servitude or those that have and those that don't? Well, for Rousseau, we've got to get, a whole new attitude. And we got to get rid of this jealousy, this cunning, this trickery, this desire for praise and power. And so to do this, he offers a principle called radical democracy. Some have said this is an awful principle. It is tyranny. Others have said this is the truest, most profound, and most beneficial form of democracy. And to understand what it means, this sense of radical democracy, we have to get to the difference between the will of all and the general will. And so the will of all is essentially the will defined by the majority. It's when a certain group of individuals takes power and structures society in such a way that they get the benefits. They get the good stuff and others don't. The will of all is essentially a kind of form of political power where certain people are trying to gain an advantage over others for themselves, for their own advantage. The general will, on the other hand, is much more universal for Rousseau. He thinks the general will is essentially the common good. It's defined by the common good. It is what is most beneficial to the whole. And so Rousseau says we all have within us, this more egotistic sense of self, and we have this more kind of compassionate, general orientation to the whole. The will of all would be that more egotistic self, and the will of all would be that more compassionate sense of self. And so when we operate society by the common good and the will of all, then society's goods, its resources, its power structures aren't given to some at the expense of others, but they're oriented to the good of the whole. They're not there to serve private individuals or the interests of certain people. They're there to serve society as a whole. Now, with this in mind, how do we get to the general will? How does that actually happen? What is it? Who defines it? Who speaks for the general will? And Rousseau would say, look, the general will is essentially you obeying yourself. It's you giving yourself to all. It's you saying, I am not going to follow my own private interests or my own private good. I am going to be governed by this common good. I'm not going to do what is best for me at the expense of others. I'm going to do what is best for the whole. Now, because this common good is an element of all of us, Rousseau says when you obey the general will, you are essentially obeying yourself. You are not enslaved, you are not dominated, because you are just following your own universal sense of what is good for the whole. And for Rousseau, we agree to do this. We agree to simply kind of give up our individual private interest for what is beneficial to all. But you got to ask the question, then, well, how does this general will avoid becoming tyrannical? Like Rousseau's critics have often charged and critiqued him and said, you're wrong, Rousseau, that this is terrible. What's going to end up happening is some people dominate others, and, many of these people suffer. They're enslaved because they have to do what is good for the whole, and they have to kind of give up themselves. And Rousseau says, look, he thinks that in order for this to work, you got to keep society small. So there's a very kind of practical element here. You got to keep society small enough where everyone in that society can meet, get together, and define the rules of that society. So for example, if you thought about it in terms of Newman, if we're going to create rules at Newman, if we're going to create a dress code, or if we're going to create a late policy, or if we're going to create an attendance policy, if we're going to create an expulsion policy, or if we're going to decide what is the next building that we should erect, if we're going to do that, the whole Newman community should get together and decide. It shouldn't be, kind of the administrators deciding for the whole, or the faculty deciding what is best for the students. Everybody gets together to define these policies. So you have to have a society small enough where you can periodically gather the whole society together and to decide what they should do. And so that is a key component of actually making this thing work. And, he's further going to say, look, every individual has to be able to freely assent to this goal, has to be able to understand. And so he's very much against kind of brainwashing, secret police, any form of intimidation or manipulation. Anything that prevents you from thinking clearly is going to be bad. And he's also, and this many people have been very critical of Rousseau about, and think it's very dangerous. He says, look, if we're going to have a will of the all, or the general will, excuse me, we need to try to get rid or minimize or reduce as much as possible the influence of smaller subgroups. Think of the Boy Scouts of America. Think of the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. Think of a particular team. Think of Planned Parenthood or something like that. We've got to get people out of these kind of smaller sub-organizations so that people can completely give themselves over to the general, the whole. And if we get rid of these kind of subcategories, which could take people's allegiances, which could lead them away from what is good for the whole, then we're going to be in a much better position. And, as a final point, so Rousseau is a social contract theorist, so he says, look, if this is going to happen, this society is going to work, it has to be agreed upon. People have to agree to enter into the contract. And so every meeting of the general will should begin with the question of, do we want to keep it going? Do we want to keep the current government or administration, or do we want to get rid of it? And so, okay, so for Rousseau, the problem is radical inequality. The problem is somehow people having power over others. His solution is this radical form of democracy where everybody gets to participate, everyone has a voice, but which ultimately operates upon the premise that there is a way to define and determine what is good for the whole, and that's what you are to obey. You can think about whether you agree or disagree with that. You can think about whether it's dangerous or profoundly beneficial. You can think about whether you like Rousseau's vision more so than somebody like Hobbes. All of that is very worthwhile.